We now shift the focus of this lecture from the European to the North American tradition of sociology, and I will introduce the first classical sociologist, Webb Du Bois. We are talking about a time period in which there was, if you want, an export of European ideas to the United States, a country that was still in the middle of building up new institutions, including universities. So Daniel Rogers, in this book, Atlantic Crossings, makes the argument that there was an active transnational intellectual community of progressive, that is not conservative orientation, of reformers that looked at European examples of the early welfare state institutions and tried to transplant these institutions to the United States. And these European ideas of social reform, in which many sociologists were also involved, remember that most of our European sociologists were also active in these movements of social reforms. These ideas then circulated in the world exhibitions, for example. So 1904, Max Weber had traveled to the United States with other sociologists to visit the St. Louis World Exhibition, and these exhibitions happened regularly throughout the 19th century as well and circulated reform ideas. But these ideas also circulated simply through young American scholars studying in European, often German universities, and then returning to the United States to build up an American university system as well. The direction of this flow of ideas was mostly one from Europe to the United States. Christian Fleck here describes also how this was even intensified in the 1930s in particular, when the Nazi persecution of socialist, Jewish, and other groups, many intellectuals were affected, then led to a mass immigration of social science scholars to the United States, who often then contributed to building up the social sciences there. After the Second World War, then there were also many Atlantic crossings, but in the reversed sense, so that many Europeans started studying at American universities up to the current day. Obviously, I hold this lecture here in English and not in German. This probably tells it all. Where prior to the Second World War, there was a certain Europeanization of the American universities, post-Second World War, there was an Americanization of the European social sciences. But before the Second World War, the United States, also before the First World War, was democratically and economically also most advanced in comparison to the European nations. So the suffrage rights were more advanced, and the GDP per capita had not only caught up with European countries by 1914, but had even overtaken most European countries, most certainly after the wars. But in, let's say, social terms and institutional welfare terms, the United States were still a laggard. So many progressivists of the first generation were then looking also to European countries, for instance, the Bismarckian reforms, but also this current of what is called municipal socialism, so welfare at the local level, to introduce these ideas in American cities. At the same time, many of the US universities that we know today were still in the making. Yeah, so Chicago University, for instance, with its first sociology department in the United States, founded in the 1890s, were basically not around at the time when the first university chairs in economics or history were held by the founders of European sociology. And this came also with the advantage to build up the new discipline much faster than happened in the European countries that had so many, let's say, feudal burdens still to carry. American universities were copied, or they copied basically the German university model with the graduate schools, but also developed institutions of their own. So the department structure up to the current day was unique, much more, let's say, non-hierarchical, cooperative way of doing research, also early co-authorships. The fellowships are an American invention, and yes, private money also helped building up Chicago University. Rockefeller Foundation money also very important to push the social sciences in the interwar years, also in a certain empirically minded positivistic direction, obviously. So we have already seen in the European context that philosophy was quite important in determining how the social sciences developed in the respective countries. And broadly speaking, we have seen within Germany a tradition of Hegelianism, right, in the early Marx sociology, of Kantianism that influenced basically all of the German sociologists of the 1880s, 1890s, Simmel above all. On the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the philosophers that inspired British empiricism, right? The John Stuart Mill, the David Humes, who basically opposed, let's say, the German idealist tradition and suggested, let's say, a philosophy of science most accustomed to the natural sciences. Yeah? Like, let's say, a philosophical current is also at the heart of early American sociology, and the current is mostly had already been referred to by its very founders, that is pragmatism. Yeah. The early generation of Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, is distinguished then from the second generation, that's John Dewey and Jane Addams, both of which are also crucial for writing also early sociology, if you want. And yeah, what is pragmatism about? So pragmatists sought to establish, let's say, a philosophical current that solves the puzzles left by this strong opposition of German idealism and British imperialism, which they interpreted to be in a stalemate, so in an enigmatic state that cannot really be solved. The basic idea of pragmatists was to, let's say, adopt the trial and error procedure used also in the natural sciences to find out new things, to also solve philosophical problems. And a famous instance of this, let's say, solving of problems with sort of practical consequences as the yardstick, is the dissolution of so-called verbal disputes. Yeah? So the pragmatists identified many, let's say, old European philosophical problems as mere verbal disputes, and saw their task in making ideas simply clearer by solving or uncovering certain disputes as purely verbal, meaning the parties in disagreement rather disagree on the use of terms, but they don't disagree about the basic underlying reality or concepts. Yeah. And one famous example of this is sort of the squirrel problem here with a quotation from William James. This human witness tries to get sight of the squirrel by moving rapidly around the tree. But no matter how fast he goes, the squirrel moves as fast in the opposite direction and always keeps the tree between himself and the man so that never a glimpse of him is caught. The resultant metaphysical problem now is this. Does the man go round the squirrel or not? End of quote. So this is a little bit of an ironic metaphysical problem, obviously, in James's sense. So we have the situation, right, that the meaning of going around the squirrel is twofold. Yeah. In one sense, the man goes obviously around the squirrel because he is at one moment sort of north of the squirrel, in the second moment west, and then south and east. And in that sense, he is going around. In the second sense, however, he's not going around, where he, for instance, never sees the back of the squirrel, right? He does not go around the very animal itself. So the meaning of going around is simply ambiguous, and the pragmatists saw the sense of philosophy in just making these ideas clear and making the use of the concept going around, as ironic as this example is, clearer, and hence also to destroy these verbal disputes and only seemingly metaphysical problems. So the basic idea then is to use sort of our sort of practical intuition to solve these very abstract problems. In, let's say, epistemology, the definition of what true knowledge is really about, then pragmatists were also against what they considered unrealistic Cartesian ideals and representational notions of truth. And the same also holds for sort of realist definitions of moral truth in ethics. So the basic idea of representationalist notions in epistemology and in ethics is that ideas are sort of on one end of the spectrum. It's sort of the mental representation of something that is in reality. So it is a reflection of, it is mirroring reality, either, let's say, factual reality or in ethics then moral reality. And truth is then about whether this representation, this mirror image, is right or wrong. Then in René Descartes, the French philosopher's skepticism, there are all kinds of problems, obviously, arising once you have this distinction between sort of the mirror image representation and the real thing, and in between you have this wedge of skepticism that is put in between, where Descartes starts questioning whether the representation is the real thing or not, and many illusions make this assumption very problematic, that the mirror image is the real image, and so on. And the pragmatist way out of sort of this dilemma of the Cartesian sort of notion of truth for empirical or moral knowledge, then is to turn to the social sciences and their just practical experimental understanding of what is true. So to find out whether something